Hello and welcome to Grow Conversations, your window into the world of medical cannabis from the United Kingdom. My name's Alex Fraser and I'm your host. And on today's episode, we have Rosemary Mazanet, Dr. Rosemary Mazanet from Columbia Care. Welcome to the show, Rosemary.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the invitation to speak.
Lovely to have you here. And I guess to start things off, perhaps you could give us a little bit of a background on Columbia Care and the sort of work that you guys have been doing.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So Columbia Care is a United States-based company. We were established in 2012, and we, up until the last few years, have been just in the United States. We are not in Canada, and more recently, we've been coming into the markets in Europe. And the reason why that's so appropriate for us is that we are really a medical marijuana company. That was our goal in the United States, was to always go in and have medically focused products that were unit dosable. So, you know, as we expanded in many states, we went into states that originally always had a medical program first. And over time, we've expanded. We're now in 18 states. We try to have sort of similar product lines in all of the states. It's a little different than here. Every state has different state requirements on what they can make and sell. So, you know, we can't be as standardized on a national footprint as we'd like to, but we try very hard to do that and to have, you know, quality medical products.
No, that's really interesting. And, you know, it's interesting to hear how a company like yours is managing the sort of differentiation between all the different states. Because I know you're based in New York, is that correct? In New York State?
The headquarters is in New York, right?
And sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's very labor intensive. It would be my point. So we have to have a grow facility that grows the product that we use and manufacture it specially in each state. We're not allowed to take the product across state lines because the federal government in the US sees it as illegal. So, you know, it's been very different than Canada, for example, where, you know, I think it's a national program. We have to have a medical marijuana program on a state-by-state basis. So that makes it a challenge. So, you know, that's why when we come to Europe, Europe does not present any more of a challenge in some ways than we did at home initially. You know, it's a challenge. Different regulations, different form factors, and you know, it keeps us nimble and always on top of things. That would be my comment. We don't get tired or bored. We can't.
Sure. I mean, and I guess it's interesting that in this particular paradigm, the USA starts to look kind of like Europe. It's just a lot of different states with different rules and regulations for how this is got to be rolled out. And, you know, you mentioned that you obviously have to create these new systems for each state that you go into, and it's going to be very similar for any country that you move into in Europe and potentially the rest of the world, I'm sure, is perhaps on the horizon for the future. I suppose it'd be interesting to know particularly which countries in Europe that you're sort of focusing on. I know that you're obviously moving into the United Kingdom, and that's, you know, very much why we're talking today. And you know, what your sort of reasons were for the countries that you've decided to focus on? Why the UK and perhaps other countries?
Well, we really we've been focused more on formulated products than on flower. Okay, so one of the things that our understanding of the products and our use of the products in the US has taught us is that medical patients and doctors who prescribe these really like to have unit dosable products, right? So, you know, to some extent, it's not satisfying to say take 2 puffs, or you know, or take 2 hits, or what, you know, whatever. Okay, so you know, a lot of the vaping, a lot of the smoking of you know, the pre-rolled cannabis cigarettes, you know, that doesn't mesh terribly well with a lot of our medical programs, education, understanding, right? So we've always liked to have factors that were a little bit more unit dosable. I mean, that's the only way you can say it. You know, take this much this every so many hours for, so, you know, X effect. And so we've tended to go or be interested in the countries that had either medical programs or medical pilots, and were interested in having form factors. So, you know, we've talked a lot to Denmark about being able to eventually expand into the Danish pilot. We've talked a lot to France about being involved in the French pilot. Excuse me. You know, we're very interested in Germany, but again, you know, we would be coming in, flower, I'll be honest, flower is not our strong suit, particularly because we can't export our own. So in many states now in the US where we've had cultivation for 5 years, we're very happy with the plants that we make there and the flower. We know what's in it, but we haven't, it's hard when you're coming across and manufacturing in a new area, because we're manufacturing in Europe. To be assured of that quality of the product when you're not vertically integrated there. So that's the challenge.
That's interesting. And I guess when you're talking about the plants and the grow side of things, is that something where you can, although you can't move product from the US, you're perhaps taking some of the genetics from the plants that you've been using there in Europe as well. So it's not
Takes time.
Performance. It's that you can't export the final product.
But cultivars take time.
Yes, of course, and there's issues around genetic consistency and things like that as well, isn't there?
Right. Where when you have extract, you know exactly what's in it, and if you don't have, because flowers, if you test, it's a little bit different. The same plant, the same mother genetics can be different over a year, depending on if it's grown outside, if it's grown indoor, there's so many variables. The humidity, everything creates a different assortment of cannabinoids that are going to be in the final product. Whereas, if you make a formulated product, you still can have a lot of cannabinoids, but you have a little bit more control because you can put some more in or take some more out that you may have, distilled from a previous run or whatever. So it gives us more flexibility to be consistent, to know what's in the product, and to be able to tell people how much of it to take to get a certain effect that they're expecting.
Right, exactly. And that's, what you're talking about there is very much the pharmaceutical model that we have, in the UK and in many other countries. So that's, I'm sure, a reassurance to healthcare professionals that might be watching this in terms of how companies like yours are looking at this. And before we move on to perhaps talking about healthcare professionals and their attitudes, I'd be interested to know, and I'm sure our viewers would be interested to know, you mentioned federal legality, and from your perspective of being in the US and operating at a high level in that country, whether you think things are going to move to in terms of legislation there on the medical side. And I guess, to give some context, what we hear in terms of news from the USA and on cannabis often is focused on recreational, on states moving forward in terms of that. And that seems to have eclipsed perhaps the progress in terms of medical that you might be seeing now. And I know this is going on in the background because we have more states with medical, literally, I think it was last week. So things are still moving, but we don't necessarily hear about that. And I guess from your point of view, how do you see things moving in terms of medical in the USA?
So medical is actually on a state level extremely well accepted, extremely well. Some very, very conservative states are allowing medical marijuana. So that's a good thing. And so patients are being heard. The appropriate farmers are being heard. They're doing it the right way. So that's excellent. The problem right now is that you're going to laugh, but I don't think that there's much federal discord about medical cannabis. It's just that we have other things to worry about. Okay, so the way our legislation works, right? Things that are very controversial, they get put into bills, and then everybody fights about. You layer bills or possible legislation with a lot of things, and then you horse trade everything, right? The problem is that cannabis isn't something, medical cannabis isn't something that you horse trade right now, because everybody agrees on with it. So it's a little bit left out of the loop because people aren't. It's not a political trading point. Okay, so we're very confident. I believe that regardless of who wins our election, that there will be support more and more support for medical cannabis in the United States. You know, it's very different than it had been 4 years ago. Recreational is obviously a whole different issue, right? And I think a lot of states want to wait and see how that has gone for the states that have done it. What have been the problems? What are the lessons learned? But the lessons learned on the medical side, I think, really support, you know, all legislators, whether they're conservative or whether they're liberals, to be interested in providing patients with this product. So that's very good news. It's sort of unusual because, you know, it's not controversial enough right now to come to the forefront.
It's funny from a British standpoint to hear that cannabis isn't controversial enough. I think it's, you know, we're in a very different space perhaps in the United Kingdom. It's has been and continues to be quite controversial, but and you know, very comforting to hear that sort of regardless of whatever the election brings. Of course, again, in terms of news coming out of the US, a lot of it's focused on the election, and you know, for good reason. It's a very high stakes election, shall we say. It's good to hear that, generally speaking, things are going to move forward sort of regardless of what happens.
That's what I think most people believe.
And I think people will be, you know, comforted to hear that things are moving in the right direction on medical, you know, despite the fact that perhaps there's more focus on recreational and perhaps just not enough focus on cannabis as an issue, because, like you say, it's not controversial enough, which is, like I say, it's an unusual thing to think about from our point of view.
Well, you know, just to give you an aside, you know, when I say about lessons learned and, you know, everybody sort of reviewing what has been going on so far, don't forget medical cannabis has been legal in California since 1996. People don't realize that. You know, and in Colorado, recreational has been legal since 2014. You know, we do have a lot of lessons learned. And although, you know, people in the UK might think everybody in the US is stoned, that's actually not the case. And, there are very few, I mean, the number of problems that get reported are actually fairly few. I mean, you know, there aren't a lot of, for example, automobile accidents as a result. They're just, I mean, you know, you can look through all the data and it's not there. You know, hospitalizations and deaths from cannabis itself don't exist. It's always cut with something else, okay? Like, you know, I know you've had problems in the UK with K2 and things, you know, bath salts, all of that. So just cannabis itself, whether it's medical or recreational, has not, you know, resulted in deaths, in ICU admissions, or in any medical issues. Unlike you know, we have a horrible opioid crisis in the United States where people are dying. So I think that part of the evolution of how people have thought about it is that, you know, it's not causing the problems that people had anticipated that it would cause. And actually, it's in many areas, it may actually be helping some existing problems not have as high a human toll. So that was my editorial comment for the day.
So I was going to say that actually on one of our other episodes with Dr. Barbara Mainfield, who's a Canadian doctor, she said the first thing that really sort of caught her attention about cannabis as a medicine was the fact that it doesn't kill, and that it, you know, especially as a pain medication, that's quite significant. What was it that sort of brought you into this space that really sort of caught your eye as a medical professional? Was cannabis something that was always on your radar, or was there a certain point where you're like, oh, that's interesting, I need to get involved with what's going on there?
Well, I was involved with Columbia Care from very early on. I happen to know the people very well, the people who founded the company. I've been involved in drug development or financing biotech companies in the United States for 30 some years. And originally they came to me and asked me if I would help them analyze data. So this is actually very fascinating. In the United States, even though these are patients, they're not treated with the HIPAA privacy rules in the United States, the medical cannabis patients. So each state requires you to have a seed to sale database, which is to prevent diversion, right? It's really for law enforcement. So, you know, you're in a database that if you are pulled over by the police officers because, you know, you ran a red light or whatever, and they go to their car and they look stuff up. This is what they're looking up in most states in the United States, right? If you have a problem, because opioids are in there, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, all classes of drugs that are controlled substances are in this, along with cannabis. So, you know, we decided that instead of looking at it from tracing every seed to see how it's sold, because we have to account for it, these are to prevent diversion, we would make it so that every patient we would follow longitudinally and see we knew what their conditions were. We knew all about them from the state. The state made us know that. And then we would look and see how often they bought, what was in the products they bought, what were the minor cannabinoids, what were the terpenes, what did they buy repeatedly? If they bought it repeatedly, it probably worked. And so we set up a huge database to do this. And now it has, hundreds of thousands of people longitudinally by their condition. And so that was how I got involved. It had to do with data in trying to learn how to best use this for people, how they will buy it on their own. And so, that's the lesson for what works for people. If they're buying it the same thing all the time with their own money, then, it has to be working, right? So that was sort of what brought me to it, was the ability to be able to look at this and synthesize it. And I do have some personal experience, and it has to do a little bit with the entourage effect. So I'm a hematologist oncologist by original training, and I was at the Harvard hospitals when I trained. And back in the late 1980s, when Marinol, which is a synthetic THC, was first approved as an antiemetic in the United States, I was a young oncologist. So I was seeing cancer patients all the time. And, they have a terrible problem, as you know, with cytotoxic drugs and nausea and vomiting. I mean, it really is bad. You can't exaggerate that. And so people would ask me, I would ask them if they would like a prescription for Marinol, whatever. People would try it. And then they would come back in a couple of weeks and I would say, how did that work for you? And they would say, well, after I tried that, it was okay. But then I had my son go down and get me some pot. This is in the late 80s in Boston. Okay, I had my son go get me some pot, and actually that worked better. If I took the whole thing, it's like so it was very interesting. I mean, I've seen the entourage effect full blown myself up close and personal back in the 80s, when people would rather get an illegal substance that was full spectrum rather than take an isolate. It's not an isolate because it's synthetic, but it's just because that was legal, that they could buy at their drugstore. So that was a big lesson for me. And I think that's always stuck with me. Patients will tell you what works for them, and we need to listen.
Yeah, that's funny that you finish on that particular point. Whenever we end up discussing the entourage effect on the show with medical professionals, that seems to be the sort of the bottom line. I guess it's partly down to the fact that we don't fully understand it yet in terms of sort of biochemical actions. But what we seem to understand, and what seems to be really consistent, is that it does have an impact, and patients notice that impact and consistently report that back. In terms of when you're looking from Columbia Care's perspective at sort of drug development, how does that information sort of guide you to making decisions with what products to put on the market, or even what sort of compounds to include in formulations for medicines? Is there a lot of patient data, a lot of feedback? Is the entourage effect something that comes up?
Well, we like to know not just how much CBD and THC people tend to repetitively buy, but what the minor cannabinoids are in them, right? And so that has led us to change some of the cultivation, to have cultivars that have more CBG, have more, other various things. I mean, we have a couple of states with some THCA, where we grow a lot of THCA. It's different in different states. I know that seems weird, but that's because different states have different allowable indications for medical. It's kind of odd, okay? So somebody who might be able to get a medical product because of their indication in Massachusetts might not be able to get it in New York, for example. But that's changing. I mean, that's sort of old in that, over the last few years, many states have tried to standardize and all have come to sort of a common set of about 12, right? But it started out being very limited. And that's when we really made sure that we had cultivars that would have appropriate, products for all different types of patients with different conditions. And, we pay close attention to the minor cannabinoids and the terpenes that we put in our products.
Well, I'm sure that's, that's really good to know from the patient's perspective, I'm sure. And also, I think there'll be people watching from other producers who will sort of be debating whether or not to be focusing on the entourage effect, perhaps whether it's too early to do so. A lot of the conversation around these medicines in the UK is very focused on THC and CBD ratios and fairly little else. with some exceptions. But I guess it's interesting that we have such a sort of minimal understanding of these other compounds. Is that something that I'm aware that you guys are with Columbia Care developing various sort of data sets? You mentioned some earlier. Is that something that you're looking to? Is there a lot of research going on, perhaps, with Columbia Care into the sort of minor cannabinoids and things, or is it more that you're focused on the impact of the medicines sort of as they're formulated?
Well, so the reality is that, why we don't know anything has to do with the fact that, that due to the WHO, due to the FDA, due to the Home Office, nobody's been able to study these, okay? Even to do animal studies required any university or institute to have special licenses. So there has been a huge disincentives to people who do primary research, animal research, to be able to really understand this receptor work. To be able to understand this. So this is why we are where we are. It has to do with, the legal realities that this was a Schedule I drug, that this was considered a narcotic and, treated the same as heroin, basically, with regard to doing any research. So there's very little animal research to help us understand this. So, obviously there's even less clinical research. Okay, you can't really experiment with people and their brains and their receptors the same way that you can with mice or animals. So, what we're left with is what we call real world data, okay, which is that we observe what people use, what people buy repetitively, then we analyze what was in it down to, a fine degree, not just CBD and THC, but other minor cannabinoids and terpenes, and see what seemed to work for them. We also ask them, we send out surveys all the time, patient-reported outcomes. What did you like? Did this do that? And so we do query people on a regular basis. And so, we're left with this. It's not prospectively defined data. Okay, it's a retrospective analysis of human behavior, if you will, but we're predicting that human behavior is meaningful, again, because they're spending their own money on it, that will be able to analyze things. So, it's funny, my government, the FDA, had said, I don't even know how many years ago now, quite a few, that they were going to start looking at real world data, real world evidence. And I've been talking about this since 2015, 2016, when this legislation first came up in the US. So, we've been collecting what we consider real world data for since 2013. And at some point, it just depends on what is a big enough N to convince people. So in some diseases, our excuse me, our N is very large. In others, I wish we had more: inflammatory bowel disease, some fibromyalgia, some smaller things. We don't have, tens of thousands, dozens of thousands of patients the way we do for neuropathy, for example. But, it's just as we get an N larger and it grows, I'm hoping that will be more meaningful and people will want to listen. I think that, your government is interested in having a registry. I think a lot of governments can help this a lot by participating in helping people keep track of what patients use and what they buy, because that's the only way we're going to learn what works.
So it's really about that real world data and capturing that and fully analyzing it to sort of see what we can take away from that and what we can, and perhaps using that as a starting point from which to then do further research.
Right.
And I remember you talking about this. So this is going back a little bit. So we actually met, I think, for the first time at a CMC event, Centre for Medical Cannabis in the UK here in, I think it was May or June 2018. But I remember you talking then, I think it was 40,000 pain patients, and you were showing the reduction in the use of opiates and other pain medicines as well. So, and I remember that being, a topic of much discussion afterwards when we were discussing and networking. And I may be wrong, but I'm fairly certain there were regulators from the UK present at that meeting as well. This is when I was doing some advocacy with the United Patients Alliance. I see what I'll say, if I can get that picture. There's a picture of us, and I was just looking just before we came online, and we're literally standing next to each other in a group of people from this meeting. So I'll get the editors to add that in, and we'll see how far we go back and how much younger perhaps we both look in that one. But that's just something that you've been sort of pushing for a long time, and I'm just saying I can vouch for that personally, because I was there in those meetings 2 years ago, and which quite nicely.
If I could make one other comment about something about that, because So, you know, I have talked to people at the NHS and, you know, shown them some of the data. The thing that I think physicians need to also realize, and that what we've learned is, you know, particularly pain scares everyone, okay? Because no one wants to have a new group of people who are addicted to yet another substance, okay? I get that. And, you know, despite the fact that, you know, the data seems to indicate that cannabis isn't an addictive substance, you know, we don't have proof of that yet, you know? I mean, Coca-Cola is an addictive substance. It's all, you know, it's all relative, right? So the thing that we've learned is that, you know, people who take this for real pain conditions, they get better and then they get worse again. They get better so people cycle in and out. It's not like people take this and they take it like every day forever. You know, they'll take it, and then when they're feeling better, sometimes they won't take it. And then, you know, it's like you would take any medication that was for a waxing and waning condition, right? So it's very interesting. It's, you know, there are subtleties in how, not only what people take, but how they take it that are very interesting about some of these data sets. You know, people don't take it all the time. Same way people don't take ibuprofen all the time. You know, they'll take it for a while, their back will feel better, they may go off it, and then when they need it again, they'll go back on. So the patterns of usage can be very interesting. You know, it's really only the epilepsy patients that never missed a dose, right? The other patients may sort of wax and wane their use. So you know, there are interesting patterns. There's a lot to know. There's a lot to be learned.
And that's, I mean, speaking to doctors, I think is something that we focus on a lot on Grow Conversations. It'd be interesting to sort of hear your perspectives, I guess, from finding doctors in the USA who perhaps knew nothing about this and then leading them to a better understanding of perhaps to prescribing. Is that a journey that takes a lot of time? Are doctors in the USA still kind of, I guess there's a whole group of people and there's going to be a lot of different individuals and their different perspectives in that, but is that something that you struggle with? Do you find doctors are quite open to the idea in the USA? Obviously in the UK, it's quite slow. I can see you shaking your head. So what are the sort of general attitudes from, for want of a better word, sort of cannabis naive doctors in the USA?
There was absolutely no reason to be an early adopter as a prescriber in the US. As a matter of fact, people were very disincented because it was federally illegal. So you would get a state license to be able to write. So I'll tell you a personal experience. I've lived in a couple of states, and I have medical licenses in a couple of states in the United States. And I got a letter from the Massachusetts Medical Society. I have a Massachusetts license, warning, along with every other doctor, warning me that if I got a license from the state to prescribe cannabis, that I was at risk of losing my federal DEA license, which would, which is the license to prescribe controlled substances. So we were warned, we were threatened not to do this, not to be. So, you know, it's people don't realize that there was, in the US, there were a lot of disincentives. There were no early adopters. The physicians were very reluctant to do this. And, all of the data in the world, I don't think could change them. What changed them were the patients. Okay. There were always some doctors who had used cannabis, knew cannabis, and were willing to write. And then those patients would say, well, they would go back to their regular physician and say, well, you need to write this for me. I'm taking it and it's helping. And if the doctors didn't, then the patients would leave them. So what happened was the patients, I think, are what really created this groundswell where, before you knew it, maybe in every large practice, one physician would have the license and write the cannabis, right? And write but it was very gradual. I have to tell you, people may have a very different idea of how this rolled out in the United States. It was very slow. And again, I could talk to doctors until they were blue in the face, or I was blue in the face and out of breath and old and, like falling apart. And they wouldn't believe me as much as they would believe, Mrs. Jones, a 43-year-old woman with bad peripheral neuropathy and diabetes. And she comes in and says, my neuropathy's better. I'm sleeping. I'm able to lose weight. I haven't even been on a diet and I've lost weight because I'm sleeping better, but those are the types of things that have changed people's minds. And so until you have a nidus, it's like a groundswell, right? Until you have a nidus of things where doctors can hear this from patients themselves, I think it's always like this. This is what's happened in the UK is not that different from what's happened in every state in the United States at some point. Now, the UK has been a little bit longer of a process than usual, but you know, it eventually will progress.
I'm sure that's very reassuring to our sort of British viewers as well. So obviously we're almost exactly 2 years. I think actually when this comes out, we might be almost exactly 2 years since we had the law change, the rescheduling, November 1st, 2018, that allowed these prescriptions for specifically unlicensed CVMPs to start rolling out. And that was obviously a breakthrough moment for us as advocates, as patients pushing for law change. What you're saying basically is we need patients to speak up, specifically when they're talking to their doctors. So not even necessarily in a
right. No, this is
setting.
just between them and their physician. They need to say, I need this drug.
Simple as that. And I completely agree with you. And we do have a lot of patients who are, even patients who are on legal prescriptions here in the UK who are afraid to go and then talk to their GP. Their GP is not the prescriber is a specialist. They go back and talk to their GP, and obviously this is all on their medical record now that they've got this prescription, but they sort of circle around the conversation. And I suppose it's that if we could say anything to patients, it's that, stand up for what's working for you, basically, and make sure that you're vocal about that. Is that what you'd say pretty much to? Yeah, I mean, and in terms of speaking from doctor to doctor, how do you sort of approach the conversation, I suppose? Is it a hard sell? Is it something that you'd sort of take very gently? I guess it's individuals have different ways of looking at it.
No, yeah, it's very individual. I mean, at some point it becomes, well, how much evidence is enough? For example, surgeons who treat a lot of pain patients, surgeons, every day they're doing procedures that have never had a clinical trial. Okay, people just dreamed up a procedure and started doing it. So more recently, sometimes for some of these procedures, there's been a randomized treatment, to see if one treatment's better than others. But for the vast majority of surgical procedures that happen every day, okay, there really isn't, there's never been a trial. There's never been a study. It's just somebody dreamt up a procedure and everybody started doing it and everybody does it. And so, the resistance to this is a little it's a little fascinating to me, because again, no one's trying to take this to the MHRA and get this approved like Epidiolex, right? I mean, that's not what anybody's trying to do. And nobody's trying to, I don't know, in the US, Epidiolex is $37,000 a year. I mean, nobody's trying to do that. That's not this model, okay? For something that a health system is going to spend a lot of money, or people are going to spend a lot of money, a medicinal product, then you want that type of evidence. For surgical procedures, we've never really required that much evidence. And so for something like this that seems to have no downside or very little downside, I think that it's going to be a process. I think that the UK did get very scarred, though. I mentioned the K2 and this stuff. I think that you guys have I think that the UK culture in general remembers that in a very, very negative way. And I think that that's sort of a problem. The CVMPs that we're talking about now are pharmaceutics are used really to make them. Okay. The quality is so good. They don't have these horrible other additives that are going to make people have very bad experiences. That are going to have those products make you have a psychoactive experience on their own, right? It's not the cannabis that's doing it; it's some of that stuff. So I think that there's a very, I think that the ground has been a little bit ruined in the UK by that type of memory, and so we have to overcome that. That this really is not doing any harm. And it may do good for some people. It's not for everyone. I'm not trying to say, it's for everyone. For some people, it will help them a lot.
And you say it doesn't do a huge amount of harm. The Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm.
Yeah.
And you're talking about K2. And for those who might not be aware, who are watching, that's K2 is one of a handful of synthetic cannabinoid drugs, street drugs, illicit drugs alongside spice, that really hit the UK. And I guess it was around 2016, 2017, there was a sort of a peak of that. And we even had a law change to sort of the Psychoactive Substances Act to sort of ban all of that entire collection of drugs and sort of remove them from any legal purchase, which I think was a good move in so far as sort of understanding that those drugs had harm and potentially were drugs of abuse, I suppose. And then we also have, I think, as a sort of alongside that in the UK, this paradigm of skunk and this sort of high THC unregulated street cannabis. And it's a similar thing. You can almost use them interchangeably. It's an illicit substance. It's unregulated and potentially more harmful than, and I'm loath to put skunk and cannabis, the plant, in along with synthetic cannabinoids that are potentially more harmful. But I think in terms of the attitudes that people have had to them,
in the US, with the worst that people had to deal with was that, everybody was, they didn't have that, or we didn't have that recent experience. We just, it's sort of like, okay, well, everybody's stoned. Who knows if their pain goes away? They're just stoned, so they don't care. I mean, it was more that, right? How do we know that it's doing anything? People are stoned. How do they know, right? It was sort of the inactivity. It was, you're going to turn everybody into a zombie, And actually, people have seen it's the opposite. So if you have people with bad pain and you start them on cannabis and they have a Fitbit, we've done this, a lot of people have done this, their activity goes up. Okay, so they're not getting, sleepy and stoned and being home all the time. As a matter of fact, they're going out more because they don't ache all over. And so it's really interesting, but it takes experience, in your own setting to be able to appreciate that.
I was going to say that sounds something I can personally attest to from my own chronic pain condition, and perhaps when I'm discussing cannabis with others who are using recreationally or in not for such severe medical issues, that the idea of me using high levels of THC, is actually allowing me to go out and have an active social life and go out and even getting me up and going to work, which I know a lot of other places I speak to with legal prescriptions are, sort of echoing. And that sort of seems like an alien concept to those who are using recreationally. I think there's a real difference in terms of, why you're using it makes a difference into the effect that it has. But then how do you explain that to a medical professional when they've seen so many people use recreationally, and certainly it can make you more lethargic and perhaps has issues with motivation. Whereas for people who are sick, this is allowing us to enact and to live our motivations and to live more full lives. So and it's fantastic that you're sort of pushing these messages and making sure the doctors are aware of how this works. And I'm really interested to hear how Columbia Care is doing this, and if there's anything particular that you guys are doing here in the UK to sort of educate and support doctors.
Well, so in the US, which will impact the UK, we have different groups of physicians who work with us to look through our database, the impact database, and publish things. So, there's a publication not long ago about geriatric patients, for example, which was helpful, that you don't need to worry, about they're not falling, they're not getting into trouble all the time. So it was sort of how they trade up and how to best use it. We have one in oncology. We have a couple that will be coming out more soon in inflammatory bowel disease. I mentioned that's one thing that is sort of we don't have a lot of good data in the literature with actual patients. So, we work with people to look at some of these in their patient populations and then publish that data. In the UK, it's an educational program. I mean, I speak with people there all the time. I've spoken with people one-on-one a lot over the last few years. Since I first started coming over, I would meet fabulous people and they would call me and say, well, look, I have this hard patient. What do you think we should get? So it's been very, very, I love that. It's fun it's fun for me to talk to people in a whole different setting about how to help their patients. We just developed some educational materials and things. If somebody has a particular interest in a particular disease state and, they have a practice that treats a lot of that, we can cut some of the data and show you what it looks like. So it's nothing earth-shattering, okay? It's not like this is going to take over the world. It's sort of, convincing, one doctor, one practice at a time. It has to be relevant to them, right? They don't want to hear sort of here's the receptor and here's the blah, they want to hear how this relates to their patients. So
it's that one-to-one, isn't it? It's that peer-to-peer education. And that's the big takeaway. And I think I don't know exactly how that works in other countries and whether that's the same in the USA, but it's definitely a real, it just seems to be how doctors sort of get information about new drugs, get information about new ways of doing things and new practices, where they have an authority or someone that they trust who's also in the same profession or a similar profession and that can pass on that data. And it's fantastic that we have people like yourself with such experience from the US, coming over and helping companies like Grow Pharma, like my company, and the others in this space for doing this work and educating these healthcare professionals and moving things forward for the benefit of their patients. So I just want to say, thank you for all of the hard work that you.
Well, there's a fascinating. Well, you probably know Queen Elizabeth I required people to grow hemp and cannabis on their, all of her serfs, right? She required everybody to grow it. Queen Victoria used cannabis. It was sold. So it's the East India Trading Company. It was allowed as a pharmaceutical product to be sold in the UK until 1928. Okay, and in the US it was 1937. And Eli Lilly, a lot of McKesson, a lot of drug companies, you would recognize the name, were selling these products. And then, and what took it off in the US really was taxes. It's a long story. It was taxes more than anything else that forced it off the market. And I'm not sure what forced it off the market in the UK, but it wasn't that it hurt anyone. It wasn't that people were being harmed. It wasn't that there was an issue. It was, it's always been very political. I think it was because it was a cultivated product to a large extent. And so, 100 years ago, these were sold as legitimate medicinal compounds. And they've been used for 5,000 years that way. So, it's hard to believe that 5,000 years worth of humans were exaggerating the effectiveness of something. That just doesn't happen,
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought that up. I don't think it's come up so far on any of our previous episodes, but the fact that cannabis and cannabis medicines were, routinely prescribed, not just now and again as a sort of unusual circumstance, but actually were some of the most, almost, I don't want to say most medicines, but a large percentage of medicines in the UK around the sort of 1910s, 1920s were made with cannabis. And if it wasn't a cannabis medicine, it was likely a medicine that cannabis was added to, perhaps to mitigate side effects or to boost the effect of other painkillers that were around at the time. And I'm not 100% sure why it changed. I do think it's probably political and economic reasons. I know that there's a particular conference that happened in Egypt where they were very upset about lots of cannabis moving through the country illicitly and wanted to put a stop to it. So I think that's partially why they've wanted a larger crackdown on access to cannabis. But why that affected doctors and their ability to prescribe, I'll never really fully understand. And it's great. There's a letter that I'm going to get all of these details wrong because it's been years since I even read it, but I know I've read it. I know I've seen it. There's a letter from UK physicians from about the early 1920s, essentially begging the government to not take away this very useful tool that they've been using for and prescribing to their patients, and hundreds of doctors signing it saying, please don't change the law on this and prevent us from prescribing it. And it's interesting, I don't know whether at the time the law was as detailed in terms of separating off recreational or illicit and also medically prescribed substances. I doubt it was, and I suspect that's probably partially why the medical prescribing of it got so lumped in with the sort of illegality of it. And then many, many years later, we differentiate now between Class B drugs that are illicit in use in the UK and scheduled drugs that are various different schedules for different access sort of levels for prescribing. And then no reassessment has happened, or at least none that's led to legal prescriptions. And of course, November 2018, we've had a law change here. But no, it's fascinating that you bring that up. And I think
Well, do you know what indica? So this is my favorite. You know, so sativa and indica. So you know, the strains don't mean as much as they used to because the genetics have been so rearranged and altered, right? But you know, indica, it was so sativa was what people had. And most of, you know, with hemp that was grown, it was agricultural. It was used as structural material. You know, it really was rope. It was everything. People's houses were made out of hemp put into stucco, right? You know. Indica comes from the sativa, or I'm sorry, the cannabis plants that seriously the East India Trading Company brought back from India. It's the Indian, it was from India. It was the cannabis from India where it was a different strain and it was known to be very good for certain pain conditions, a lot of conditions. And, you know, in some places in you know, other countries, it's still considered part of a holy religious ceremony, right? They still use cannabis in all sorts of religious ceremonies according to that custom. So, you know, no, it's just funny. I mean, indica was the cannabis that the East India Trading Company brought to Europe and the New World from, you know, so the history of all of this is just fascinating. And, you know, the UK is very, very crucial in the history. It's interesting.
Yeah, we were a big part of the, like you say, the East Indian Trading Company bringing cannabis to sort of Europe and the world in that era. And you've got, you know, Dr O'Shaughnessy, who's an actually Irish, not British doctor, who went over to Indica, brought cannabis back and studied it medically. He was a medical doctor and sort of developed the ideas that we have around sensimilia, which is that basically isolating female plants so they don't become, what's the word? So that they're not pollinated, and therefore the production of cannabinoids is heightened because of, I believe it's because of added stress, because of the lack, or they just don't, or the pollination stops.
Yeah.
Yes, it's the growing bigger flowers because you're trying to attract a mate, I suppose. And yeah, I'm sort of delving into areas where I perhaps need to get a botanist on the show.
But it's fascinating, you know, that this was this was legal, this was accepted, this was commonly used. Again, the royal family used it, and then all of a sudden there were some political issues that, and the political issues were worse probably in the U.S. than they were in the U.K. But you know, this sort of ground it all to a halt, and you know, we're slowly sort of, you know, recreating the wheel, but it's slow.
And that's the tragedy of it. I think a lot of the time people ask, why are we where we are? Why do we not have better evidence? Why do we not have clinical trials in this? And I think the bottom line really is that it's because it's been prohibited for so many years. And that's led to, you know, barriers in legislation from doing the trials that we would have now. And it's a really difficult paradigm because, of course, you've got the governments now in the UK at least saying, well, this is okay and you can have this, we can prescribe this and even do studies on it. But the reality is we would probably have this already on our NHS as a normal medicine. And even, you know, for someone myself, you know, diagnosed over a decade ago, started advocacy in 2014. But potentially when I was diagnosed at 19 years old, I could have just had a medicine straight away from THC or CBD or something like that. And we might be, you know, way further down the line. But I wouldn't be having this lovely conversation with you, and we wouldn't be doing this right now. But it is frustrating. And I think from patients' point of view, there's not much you can do about the past, but it is very much that is, and we can just work as hard as we can to essentially catch up. And it's a different world now, obviously, to the 1920s. Medical science is in a very different place to where it was then. And I suspect that the catching up that we need to do will happen relatively quickly. But sadly, probably not quick enough for many patients. And that's sort of the tragedy of prohibition, really. And it's that this is the sort of the particular place where the illegality of cannabis and the medical sort of aspects of cannabis sort of cross paths, and really the sort of the victims of that are the patients, and perhaps, you know, medical professionals who could be I don't want to say more effective at their jobs, but they would have another tool in their toolkit for the patients that they see. So no, it is fascinating, and I think we're sort of coming to the end of our time. Unfortunately, I think we could sit and we could talk about this all evening and tomorrow morning as well. It's great to get your insights. It's fantastic to hear about what's going on in the USA. It's certainly reassuring to hear that things were relatively slow in terms of their uptake in the USA, and that we're sort of following a similar trajectory in the UK. Obviously, you've got about half a decade at least ahead of, well, and plenty more than that if you count California ahead of us, and hopefully it won't take us that long to catch up with you guys. And I remember having a similar sort of conversation with Barbara from Canada, and we're also obviously quite some way ahead. So, but thank you so much for joining us, Rosemary. It's been an absolute pleasure. I do wish we could do this for longer, but I do have to cut it somewhere. But it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, and I hope to see you in person soon.
Yes, likewise. We do make sure that we can get in touch when you're back in the UK, in London perhaps, or even if I'm over in the USA, and we can maybe do another episode in person. That would be lovely. So
okay.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for watching. Do subscribe, do check out all the other videos that we've got for you, and thanks very much for watching.